time for yet another book review starring me! I'm deep in the reads, and the book that we're looking at today is called God, a Biography by Jack Miles. Jack Miles writes about religion from a sort of cultural historical perspective. God was his debut book, and it instantly won him international acclaim as well as a Pulitzer Prize. The book looks at God as he's depicted in the Old Testament and the Jewish Tanakh, and uses the events in scripture to paint a portrait of God as a character with an arc. As soon as I heard about this book, I knew I had to read it. I was actually raised Catholic and I took it way too seriously. I read my first Bible when I was 12 and I was like super familiar with it. But ironically, reading the Bible is what made me first start to question my faith and eventually become an atheist. I noticed that God's personality and even his motivations completely change as the Bible progresses, and of course I couldn't ignore all the inconsistencies that just kept piling up as you read along. So knowing that Jack Miles was trying to make a unified character study out of those same incongruities, I knew the book was going to be up my alley. And while the book is definitely a study of God as a character, it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it a biography, because usually you expect biographies to read like a proper story with the central figure as a main character, sort of, but this book was way more academic and dry than I was expecting going into it. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I definitely enjoyed the ride in spite of that. This book follows the Hebrew Tanakh ordering of scripture as opposed to the Old Testament. So it starts at Genesis and it ends at Chronicles, and for each book of scripture it roughly corresponds to a chapter in here. And each chapter talks about how major events impact God's character. So I'll just read a passage towards the end of the book that kind of recaps some of the events and how they affected God. After each of God's major actions, he discovers that he has not quite done what he thought he was doing, or has done something he never intended to do. He did not realize that his covenant with Abraham would require him to go to war with Egypt. He did not realize when he went to war with Egypt that his victory would leave him with an entire people on his hands that would require him to become a lawgiver. He did not realize when he gave them the law that where there is law, there can be transgression, and that therefore he himself had turned an implicitly unbreakable covenant into an explicitly breakable one. And it goes on like that, but you get the idea. You can easily chalk up the discrepancies in God's motivation as simple contradictions that are natural from a book that's been compiled over hundreds of years by different people. But the conceit of this book is to unify all of those incongruities into a single character study. So instead of it being like, oh, it's just a contradiction, Miles is saying, no, God is changing his mind because he's learning how to be a god as he goes. And not only is Jack Miles pulling from the scriptures, he's also pulling from historical context and looking at other local religions from the time to show how they may have influenced the direction of scripture. The other thing that's interesting is he chalks up a lot of the issues with God's internal conflict to the fact that this is a new monotheism, and most religions at the time had multiple gods, so the different sides or personalities would be competing gods, like striving for dominance or whatever. But because God is the only God, then the conflict has to come from within him, or it has to come from his own creations, like humans. So everything that's happening is set in motion and under the control of God. I thought this book was at its absolute strongest when it was discussing the narrative parts of scripture, like Exodus or Joshua. Where it started to lose me was towards the middle, when it starts to deal with the non-narrative parts of scripture, like the Song of Solomon or Proverbs. That's when he got really deep in the sauce, talking about all this philosophical sophistry, but then he pulls it back towards the end with the book of Job and those narrative chapters, and Job was just incredible. So if you don't know, the book of Job is where God makes this weird wager with the devil to see if one of his most loyal followers will still be loyal to him if he fucks up his life completely. So God just bullies Job for the whole book, and then at the end, Job is like, why are you doing this to me? And God is like, I'm God, I'm really cool, you need to worship me. And conventional interpretations would have you believe that Job eventually acquiesces and starts to worship God again. But Jack Miles has a very different contention, which at first I resisted, which is that Job is actually being defiant, and all he's doing is acknowledging that God is all-powerful. But Job is questioning God's morality and his justice at the end, and he never gets a meaningful answer. God leaves after this confrontation and never meaningfully interacts with people again in the Tanakh. Like, he appears to Daniel in a vision, and there's an offhand mention of him maybe influencing Cyrus the Great, but Job is pretty much the last showdown for God. And like I said, at first I was not really accepting his interpretation, but Miles is really great at using scripture to argue his point, and as he did that, I started to believe him, and I was like, how have I never read the book of Job like this before? I was really impressed with just how well the premise of this book worked with scripture. Jack Miles is looking at God as if he's a protagonist in a story with a clear character arc, which is anathema to how you're supposed to view God, because God's supposed to be omnipotent, he's supposed to be never changing and all this stuff, but it's amazing the detail he's able to pull from scripture in order to support his thesis of a very much changing God as a character. One of the big questions that Jack Miles has about God's personality is also one of the really big questions I had when I was questioning my religion, which is, why does God leave? Like, at the beginning of scripture, you can just run into him, there he is, you can talk to him, you can get into a wrestling match with him. But then in Exodus, he hides behind a burning bush or a pillar of fire or what have you, and his miracles, which were huge and big and epic in the beginning, get smaller and smaller, and he becomes more and more abstract too. Like, he suddenly gets described as unknowable and omniscient when he was definitely neither of those things in the beginning. And then in the book of Job, he goes silent afterwards, and Jack Miles leaves you with this weird ominous feeling of absence at the end of this book, which really brought me down to how I was feeling when I was first realizing that I was an atheist. Now, at this point, it should probably go without saying that your enjoyment of this book is going to largely depend on a few things. One is that if you're really devoutly religious, I feel like that might get in the way of enjoying this book or taking it for what it is. Like, I saw a lot of indignant reviews from very religious people that were mortified that they would even consider looking at the Bible from a literary or historical perspective. But that's not to say that if you're religious, you can't get something out of this book. You can look at it as just a way of looking at the historical, cultural context that your holy book was written in. The other thing that might get in the way of enjoying this book is that you should at least have a basic understanding of the events and their ramifications in scripture. Like, Jack Miles does do some effort to get you up to speed if you're not fresh with it, but like I said, this book has a very academic tone, and it does presume a basic amount of knowledge at least. Like, I've read the Bible multiple times, and there were still parts where he started to lose me, and I was like, okay, I have to try to remember scripture here. It's mostly minor. The biggest key parts of this book are explained pretty well. Having said all that, though, I still found that my main problem with this book was that it was much more academic and dense in tone than it really needed to be. Jack Miles definitely could have made this more accessible and engaging all the way through, but as it stands, you need to go into this book already having a very strong interest in religion and mythology, because I don't think Jack Miles's writing is quite strong enough to spark that interest in you on its own. The other thing is, and this is probably a personal preference, but I wish he'd gone into less detail in some places, like Psalms and Proverbs, and more detail in others. But overall, this was a really informative and interesting book. I feel like I learned a lot, that I have a very new outlook on the Bible, and overall I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. If you're looking for an unorthodox deep dive into religion and God and the motivations behind it and the history, then this is the book for you. It's definitely like right up your alley. If you're into books like this and you know of some recommendations, let me know. I'm considering reading St. Augustine, for example, so I might be reading more books like this soon. But yeah, subscribe, comment, like, do all those things. I'm going to go to bed now because it's like 2 in the morning. Goodbye.